14 houses turned them away. 14 front doors opened, just enough to see 2 women standing in an ice storm. 14 people decided it wasn't their problem. I know this because the younger one told me. She said it like she was reading a grocery list. No anger, no tears. Just a fact. 14 doors, all closed. I was number 15. The last house on Millwood Road, at the edge of Forks, Washington, where the pavement turns to gravel and the pines grow so thick you can't see the sky. And if I'm being honest, I almost didn't open mine either, but I did. And what happened over the next 24 hours changed everything I thought I knew about my mother, about strangers, and about the kind of doors that only open once in a lifetime. Let me start from the beginning. Before I tell you what happened when I opened that door, I need you to do something for me. If you've ever let a stranger in when nobody else would, or if someone once opened their door for you when you had nowhere left to go, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this story is going to change the way you think about the people standing on the other side. Trust me now. Back to that night. My name is Owen Carter. I was 27 years old. I lived alone in a house that was too small for 2 people and too quiet for 1. Forks is the kind of town where people know your truck before they know your name. I drove a gray Dodge with a cracked taillight. I worked at Boyd's garage during the day, fixing brakes and transmissions for loggers and fishermen. But the real work happened after hours. In my garage, I had 3 cars that nobody else wanted. A 1972 Chevelle with a seized engine and a paint job that looked like a bruise. A 67 Mustang in gray primer that hadn't moved since I bought it off a widow in Sequim. And a rusted-out Ford truck that I kept because, honestly, it asked nicely. Something about the way it sat there, tilted and stubborn. It reminded me of someone my mother. Her name was Margaret. She was a mechanic, a real one. She could diagnose an engine by sound the way some people recognize a song from the first 3 notes. She taught me everything. How to rebuild a carburetor, how to read the color of exhaust smoke, how to be patient with something broken, because broken doesn't mean finished. She had this saying. She'd be working on some car that everyone else had given up on, and the engine would finally turn over after weeks of silence. And she'd wipe her hands on her jeans and say, "Some doors only open once. Owen, you gotta be standing there when they do." I thought it was just a mechanic thing. Timing, patience, knowing when to turn the key. She passed when? I was 16, quietly, the way she did everything. One morning she was there, and then she wasn't, and the shop got very silent. My father tried to hold it together for about 6 months. Then the bottles started showing up. Then he stopped showing up. Eventually, he just left, drove away one Tuesday, and never came back. So it was me and the shop. Me and the tools. Me and a vintage flathead screwdriver with a wooden handle worn smooth from her grip. On the steel shaft near the handle, there was an engraving, small, clean. 2 words, M. Mercer, and below that, a tiny stamp that looked like a ship's wheel. I always figured it was a brand name. Some old tool company I never looked up. It didn't matter. It was hers. I carried it in my front shirt pocket every single day, the way she used to. Like a pen. Like a heartbeat. I had no idea what that name actually meant. The ice storm hit Forks on a Thursday evening in January. Not rain. Not snow. Ice. The kind that coats everything in glass and makes the whole world look like it's been dipped in resin. Power lines sagging under the weight. Trees cracking like fireworks in the dark. The roads turned into skating rinks by 6 o'clock. By 8, the power was out on my entire street. The only light in my house came from a space heater that glowed orange and only warmed one side of the room. If you sat on the left side of the couch, you were fine. If you sat on the right, you could see your breath. Not that it mattered. I wasn't on the couch. I was in the garage finishing a brake line on the Chevelle, with the radio playing something old and the rain turned ice, ticking against the tin roof like 1,000 tiny fingernails. I remember thinking, this is a night where nothing happens. This is a night where you work on something broken, eat something cold, fall asleep listening to the wind. I was wrong about all of it. The knock came at 9:14. I know the time because I'd just looked at the clock on the wall. The one my mother hung in 2007 that still runs 3 minutes fast. The knock wasn't polite. It wasn't hesitant. It was desperate. The kind of knock that comes from someone who's already been told no to many times and is running out of doors to try. I wiped my hands on a rag, walked through the kitchen. Opened the front door. 2 women stood on my porch. The older one had dark hair pulled back tight, arms crossed, jaw clenched. She looked at me like I might be the worst decision she'd make that night. The younger one was soaked. Her jacket was too thin for January. Her teeth were chattering. But she was smiling. Not a big smile. Just the corners of her mouth, like she was trying to convince herself that things were still okay. The younger one spoke first. "Can we stay tonight?" Our car slid into a ditch about 2 miles east. "We've been walking since..." Nobody else would open their door. The older one added, without looking at me. "We can pay." I looked past them at the road. Ice everywhere. No headlights. No sound except the wind tearing through the pines. 14 houses. I was the last one on the street. Some doors only open once. I was standing right there. "Come in," I said. "I don't want your money, but I should warn you about something." They both looked at me. "There's only one bed. And the couch is..." Honestly, the couch is more of a suggestion than furniture. The younger one laughed. A real laugh. Unexpected and warm, like finding a lit candle in a dark room. It caught me off guard so hard, I forgot what I was going to say next. The older one stared at me. "We'll sleep in the car." The younger one turned to her. "Margot, the car is in a ditch. That's literally why we're here." Their names were Margot and Tessa. Margot was 28. Tessa was 24. They were sisters. That's all I knew. That's all I needed to know. I gave them the bedroom. The bed sagged in the middle, and the sheets were clean but old. The pillowcases had a pattern of small blue flowers that my mother picked out 15 years ago. I never changed them. Never saw a reason to. I pulled a sleeping bag out of the hallway closet. Army green. The zipper hadn't worked since 2003. I grabbed a wool blanket off the back of the broken couch and laid everything on the workshop floor. Next to the Chevelle, on concrete that smelled like oil and cold metal. The space heater hummed its orange warmth from the corner. The Chevelle loomed above me like a patient animal. As I was walking out of the hallway, Tessa stopped me. She was standing in the bedroom doorway, still in her wet jacket, her hair half dry and tucked behind one ear. She said, "Thank you. I mean it. You're the only one who opened the door." She didn't say it like it was dramatic. She said it the way you say something true. Quietly, simply, like a fact that deserved to be spoken out loud. And she held eye contact when she said it. Not challenging, not flirting, just present, like she wanted me to know that she saw me. Not the house, not the furniture me. I opened my mouth to say something. Anything, "You're welcome," or "It's nothing," or "Anyone would have done it." But nothing came out. She had this way of looking at you that made small talk feel dishonest, like words that were less than true would be an insult to the moment. I nodded, closed the door, walked to the garage. I lay down on the concrete next to a car that didn't run, wrapped in a sleeping bag that didn't zip, with a wool blanket that smelled like cedar in old closets. And I slept better than I had in months, maybe years. I still don't fully understand that. Maybe it was knowing that for the first time in a long time, there were other heartbeats in my house. Maybe it was the sound of the ice settling on the roof, reminding me that outside was brutal but inside was safe. Or maybe it was just that I'd opened a door I almost didn't. And something about that felt like the first honest thing I'd done in years. Morning came gray and quiet. The ice storm had passed, but the roads were still closed. Everything outside was coated in glass. The trees looked like chandeliers. The power lines sparkled in the weak winter sun. Beautiful and dangerous. The way only the Pacific Northwest can be in January. I was under the hood of the Chevelle when Tessa walked into the garage. She had a battered Moleskine sketchbook under her arm and a pencil behind her ear. She was wearing one of my flannels over her thin jacket. She must have found it on the hook by the door. It was 3 sizes too big, and she'd rolled the sleeves up twice. She didn't mention it. I didn't either. She didn't say good morning. She just looked around the shop like she'd walked into a cathedral. Slowly, respectfully, taking in the pegboard wall with its outline of tools, the oil stains on the concrete that looked like abstract paintings if you stared long enough, the smell of grease and cold metal and the faint sweetness of old wood. How many cars do you have in here? 3, the Chevelle, the Mustang over there, and the truck in the corner. What's wrong with the truck? Nothing. I just keep it because it asks nicely. She smiled at that. A real smile, not the half-frozen one from the porch. Then she sat down on an overturned crate, opened her sketchbook, and started drawing. I went back to work. For 20 minutes, neither of us said a word, and it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that happens when 2 people are comfortable doing different things in the same room. The kind of silence I hadn't shared with anyone since my mother was alive. Then she said, "Can I sketch your hands?" Nobody had ever asked me that before. I held them out, palms up like I was offering her something I didn't know how to name. Grease under the nails, a scar across the left, thumb from a timing chain incident in 2021, calluses from 15 years of wrenches and ratchets. Hands that most people looked past or looked away from. She drew for a while, carefully, quietly. I watched her eyes move from my hands to the page and back. She was seeing something in them that I couldn't see myself. Something worth recording? Then she asked about my mother. I don't talk about my mother. Not to anyone. Not to the guys at Boyd's. Not to the bartender at the Cedar Lodge who's known me since I was 19. But something about the way Tessa asked, or maybe something about the morning, or maybe something about watching someone draw your hands like they mattered, made me talk. I told her about Margaret. How she taught me everything I know. How she could hear an engine the way musicians hear pitch. How she would spend 3 weeks on a car that any other mechanic would scrap, because she believed that everything broken has a version of itself that still works. You just have to find it. How she passed when I was 16 and the whole world went quiet. And I learned to live inside that silence because there was nobody left to break it. Tessa stopped drawing. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought maybe I'd said too much. Then she said, "She sounds like someone who understood that the best things aren't built from money. They're built from patience." Nobody had ever described my mother that way, not once. And hearing it from a stranger who'd known me for less than 12 hours felt like someone had opened a window in a room I'd kept sealed shut for 11 years. The air rushed in, and it hurt, and it healed at the same time. While we talked, she noticed the screwdriver in my pocket. "Can I see that?" I handed it to her. She turned it in her fingers, carefully, the way she handled everything. Read the engraving. Mercer. Looked at the little ship's wheels stamped below the name. She tilted it toward the window light. Her eyebrows moved, just slightly. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something. Then she closed her moleskin and said, "Never mind. It's probably nothing." It wasn't nothing. But neither of us knew that yet. Margot came into the kitchen while I was making breakfast. Eggs in a cast iron skillet older than me. Toast from bread that was one day past its date but still honest. Coffee that was strong enough to have opinions. I set the table for 3. I only owned 3 plates anyway, so it worked out. Margot leaned against the kitchen doorframe and watched me cook. She watched me not ask them questions. I didn't ask where they came from. I didn't ask why they were driving through Forks in January. I didn't ask about the car in the ditch or the 14 doors or anything that wasn't eggs and coffee. I figured if they wanted me to know, they'd tell me. And if they didn't, that was their business. I was raised by a woman who believed that the most generous thing you can do for someone is give them room to be private. Margot noticed this. I could tell because something in her shoulders changed. She went from leaning like she was guarding the doorway to leaning like she was resting against it. Small difference. "But I saw it," she said quietly to Tessa. "He's not what I expected." Tessa, without looking up from her sketchbook, "What did you expect?" Margot, "Someone who'd want something." Heard it. I didn't react. I just held up the skillet and said, "I do want something." I want someone to tell me if these eggs are terrible because I genuinely can't tell anymore. Tessa laughed again. That same warm, sudden laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than politeness. Margot almost smiled. Almost. Her jaw unclenched for about half a second. And in Margot language, that was practically a standing ovation. We ate breakfast together. 3 strangers at a table built for one, with mismatched forks and coffee mugs that said things like, "Boyd's Auto, we break for nobody." And for the first time in years, my house didn't feel too quiet. It felt like a house was supposed to feel. Like someone had turned the volume back on. Tessa told me they were from Portland. That they'd been driving north with no particular destination. That their father was complicated, and that they were trying to figure out what their lives looked like without him designing every room. She said this without bitterness. More like sadness. The kind of sadness that comes from loving someone who only knows how to love you on their terms. I didn't press. I just poured more coffee and let the morning be what it was. The afternoon came slow and heavy. Roads were clearing. The ice was melting off the power lines in long silver drips. Somewhere in the distance, a chainsaw buzzed, clearing fallen branches. I was starting to think about helping them pull their car out of the ditch when I heard the gravel. Not a local truck. Not a logging rig. Something heavier. Something expensive. A black Escalade. Tinted windows. Chrome wheels that had no business on a gravel road in Forks. Rolling up my driveway with the slow confidence of something that knows it. Doesn't belong but doesn't care. A driver in a suit stepped out first. Opened the rear passenger door. Then a man in a dark cashmere coat stepped onto my gravel like it was a hotel lobby carpet. Late 50s. Silver hair cut close. The kind of posture that says, "I own every room I enter, including this one, including the one you're standing in." He didn't knock. He opened my front door and walked in like he had a key. Margot's face turned to stone. Every muscle in her jaw locked. Tessa went pale. The color drained from her cheeks in about 2 seconds flat. The air in the room changed completely. Whatever warmth the morning had built, this man sucked it out by walking through the door. The man looked at his daughters, briefly, clinically. Then he looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you're thinking about moving. Or throwing out. "You've made your point," he said to them. Out! Not angry. Quiet. The kind of quiet that's louder than yelling because it leaves no room for argument. Time to come home. He reached into his coat and placed a neat stack of $100 bills on my kitchen table. For the inconvenience, I looked at the money. Then, I looked at him. Then, I pushed the money back across the table with one finger. "There's no inconvenience." They knocked. I opened the door. That's it. Something flickered in his face. Not anger. Surprise. Like he wasn't used to someone pushing money back. Like the gesture didn't compute. His name was Douglas Ashford. I'd learn the rest later. Billionaire, timber, shipping, real estate. He'd tracked his daughters through the GPS in their car. He had a lawyer waiting in the Escalade and probably a helicopter on standby somewhere in Port Angeles. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He negotiated. And that was worse. Because threats you can refuse. Negotiations make you feel like you've already lost something just by listening. He started talking about arrangements. About the car in the ditch? About a plane ticket waiting in Seattle? About how Margot's position at the company was still open and how Tessa's trust fund could be reinstated with one phone call. He laid it all out the way a general lays out a battle plan. Calm, efficient, total but then something happened that I didn't expect. Douglas's eyes moved past me, past the kitchen, past the table with the pushed-back money. They traveled through the open door into my garage and landed on the workbench. On a specific spot on the workbench. On the screwdriver. He stopped mid-sentence. His mouth was still open, still forming a word about stock options or trust funds. But the word never came out. He walked over, slowly, picked up the screwdriver, turned it in his hand. His thumb found the engraving the way your thumb finds a scar it already. KNOWSM Mercer, the ship's wheel. And he stopped breathing for half a second. He held it like it burned him. And for the first time since he walked into my house uninvited and unwelcome, I saw something I didn't expect in a billionaire's eyes. Fear now. Before I tell you what that screwdriver meant. And trust me, you are not ready for this. I want you to drop one word in the comments. Door. Just the word door. Because I want to know how many of you are still here. Still listening, still standing at the door with me. Drop it now, and let's walk through the rest of this together. Douglas held the screwdriver and said, "Where did you get this?" "It was my mother's." "What was her name?" "Margaret. Margaret Carter." He set the screwdriver down on the workbench. Very carefully. Like it was made of glass. Then he sat down. Just sat on a shop stool, in his cashmere coat, in a mechanic's garage in Forks, Washington. It was the first unscripted thing he'd done since he arrived. The first moment where he wasn't performing control, and then Tessa spoke. She'd been turning that name over in her mind. All morning, Mercer. The engraving she'd read hours ago while sketching. The name she'd noticed and filed away and almost mentioned, and then didn't. She'd been connecting it slowly, the way you piece together a dream after you wake up. Mercer, the Mercer family. The name she'd heard at board dinners and charity galas her entire childhood. Her father's oldest partners, the Pacific Northwest dynasty that built half the timber industry alongside the Ashfords, and the daughter who disappeared. Tessa looked at me. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "Your mother was Margaret Mercer. The Mercers and the Ashfords. Our families were partners for over 50 years. Your mom was the Mercer daughter who fell in love with someone her family didn't approve of. A mechanic. In a small town, she chose him. And when she did, they cut her off. Completely. Erased her. My father used to talk about it when we were growing up. He called it a cautionary tale. Stood very still. Everything I thought I knew about my mother, every memory, every lesson, every evening in the garage was still true. All of it. But it was also bigger. She didn't just teach me how to fix engines. She taught me how to choose. She chose my father. She chose the shop. She chose grease over gold and a flathead screwdriver over a fortune. And the family she left behind punished her for it by pretending she never existed. The screwdriver. Mercer. The ship's wheel. Not a brand. A family crest. The only thread my mother kept to the world she walked away from. And she put it in her front pocket every single day and carried it like it meant nothing, when really it meant everything. I looked at Douglas. He was staring at the wall. Not at me. Not at his daughters. At something far away. Then he said, very quietly, almost to himself, "The Mercers lost Margaret. They pushed, and she left, and they never saw her again. Not once in 40 years. The family never recovered. The bitterness ate them alive." He looked at Margot, then at Tessa. And for the first time, his voice wasn't negotiation. It wasn't strategy. It was something raw and harder to hide. I told myself I wouldn't make their mistake. I told myself I was protecting you. That everything I did, the control, the plans, the structure, was to keep you close, to keep you safe. Margot, sharp and clear. You made the exact same mistake, Dad. You just used money instead of silence. Douglas didn't argue. He didn't apologize either. That wasn't who he was. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But something cracked. A hairline fracture in the foundation of a man who had spent 30 years believing that. Control was the same thing as love. He turned to me. "I'm not going to offer you money again. I want to ask you something. Did your mother ever regret it? Leaving everything behind?" I thought about it. Really thought. I thought about Margaret Carter, who used to hum while she worked, and who made pancakes on Sunday mornings, and who never once mentioned the Mercers or money or the life she left behind. She talked about engines. She talked about patience. She talked about doors that only open once, I said. I don't think she regretted a single day. Douglas nodded. He stood up, brushed off his coat. He looked at Margot and Tessa with something I hadn't seen before. Not control, not negotiation. Something closer to surrender, but not quite. Closer to respect. "I'm at the hotel in Port Angeles," he said. "When you decide what you want to do, call me." "Not before." He walked out. The Escalade pulled away down the gravel road. No ultimatum. No conditions. Just a man who, for the first time in his life, chose to wait instead of grip. Evening came slow and cold. The pines outside were dripping with melting ice. The light turned silver, and then blue, and then dark. The house felt different now. Emptier in one way. Fuller in another. Margot decided to drive north, Seattle, maybe further. She had her own chapter to write, and it didn't include Forks, or her father, or anyone else's story. She packed her bag in silence, checked her phone for road conditions, and put on her coat. Before she left, she stopped at the front door and squeezed my arm, hard, like she was testing whether I was real. "You're a good man, Owen Carter. Weird taste in furniture, but a good man." Then she was gone. Taillights disappearing up Millwood Road toward the highway. Tessa was sitting on the porch steps when I came outside. Her moleskin was open on her knees, but she wasn't drawing. She was staring at the road where the Escalade had been. Where Margot's car had just been. Where everything had changed in the span of a single afternoon. "I don't know what to do," she said. Not to me. To the air. To the pines. To nobody. I sat down next to her. Not close. Just near. I didn't say anything for a while. The ice dripped off the gutters in a slow rhythm. Somewhere in the trees a bird was testing whether it was safe to sing yet. Then I said my mom used to say something. She said it about engines, but I think she meant it about everything. Tessa looked at me. Some doors only open once. I wasn't telling her what to do. I wasn't asking her to stay. I was giving her back the words the way my mother gave them to me, as a compass, not a command. Tessa was quiet for a long time. Then she stood up, put her moleskin under her arm, and said, "There's a ceramic space for rent on Forks Avenue. I saw the sign when we were walking in the storm last night. I almost didn't notice it. But I did." She stayed. Not for me. She was very clear about that, and I respected it completely. She stayed because for the first time in her life she was choosing a place instead of running from one. She was choosing the shape of her own days. No trust fund. No father's blueprint. No safety net except her own hands and whatever she could build with them. She said she'd come by the garage sometime. I told her the Mustang still needed bodywork if she wanted to sketch something ugly. She smiled. That same warm smile from the porch the night before, except now it wasn't half frozen. It was full. She picked up her moleskin and her thin jacket. She walked toward town in the last blue light of the day, and I was alone again. But it was a different kind of alone. The kind that has a door in it. I walked into the garage. The Chevelle sat there, half-finished, patient as always. The Mustang in its gray primer. The stubborn truck in the corner, still tilted, still asking for nothing. The tools on the pegboard in their careful outlines. The space heater humming its one-sided warmth. The clock on the wall that still runs 3 minutes fast. I picked up the screwdriver. Turned it in my hand the way Douglas had, but gentler. The way my mother used to. Read the 2 words I'd read 10,000 times without understanding. Mercer. The ship's wheel. My mother's real name. My mother's real story. My mother's real choice. She wasn't poor because life dealt her a bad hand. She was free because she played the only hand that mattered. She chose my father. She chose this town. She chose oil and metal and patience over everything the Mercer name could have given her. And she never once looked back. She just picked up her screwdriver every morning, slid it into her front pocket, and went to work on whatever was broken. Because that's what she believed in. Not money. Not legacy. Just the quiet act of making something whole again. "Some doors only open once," I said to the empty shop. "You walk through yours, Mom." I slid the screwdriver back into my pocket. Felt the weight of it against my chest. The same weight she felt every day for 20 years. And last night, I think I walked through mine, turned off the shop light, stepped onto the porch. The cold Pacific Northwest air hit my face, and it felt clean. The pines stood tall and dark against a sky that was finally clearing. Stars were coming out, one by one, like they'd been waiting for the storm to pass before they showed themselves. Somewhere down the road, ice was melting off the branches and catching the last light like pieces of glass falling in slow motion. Somewhere in town, a woman with a sketchbook was starting over, and I was standing on my porch, with my mother's screwdriver in my pocket and a door behind me that I'd never close again. Not sad, not triumphant, just warm, just full. Just the quiet truth that some doors only open once. You don't always know which ones they are until you're already standing on the other side.